For decades, the United States concealed a pact that swapped justice for advantage. It granted immunity to more than 1,000 German scientists who had built weapons of terror, and in return harvested their knowledge to win the coming Cold War. The beneficiaries were not only the architects of America's post-war missile program, but an entire generation of citizens whose safety now rests on rockets once forged by hands stained with war crimes. Understanding this hidden bargain matters today because every launch from Cape Canaveral carries a legacy that was deliberately erased, and the moral calculus made then still informs how we balance security against accountability. In July 1945, as the last bombs fell over Japan, senior officers of the Office of Strategic Services convened in a nondescript Washington hotel. Their agenda was not reconstruction or demobilization, but a clandestine assessment. Could the expertise that powered Germany's V-2 rockets be turned to America's own strategic needs? The answer was an unspoken yes, and the decision birthed Operation Paperclip, a program that would quietly import over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians into the United States. The first meetings were a blend of pragmatism and moral compromise. U.S. officials offered these men full immunity from prosecution, even if evidence linked them to forced labor camps or the use of concentration camp prisoners in rocket testing. In exchange, they demanded nothing less than unrestricted access to their research, designs, and the very minds that had turned terror into technology. The agreement was sealed before the Nuremberg trials even began, setting a precedent that expertise could outweigh justice. When the International Military Tribunal opened in November 1945, prosecutors presented dossiers that listed hundreds of Nazi officials for trial. Among them were the very scientists the United States had just recruited. To prevent these names from appearing before an international court, American intelligence agencies began a systematic alteration of records. Files were edited, incriminating evidence was removed, and new white papers were drafted that portrayed the German engineers as apolitical innovators forced by circumstance to serve their country. These falsified dossiers traveled across continents, reaching the desks of Nuremberg prosecutors who, unaware of the manipulation, found certain key witnesses mysteriously unavailable. The altered records also served a domestic purpose. They allowed the U.S. State Department to argue that none of the imported scientists were war criminals, thereby sidestepping congressional oversight and public scrutiny. In effect, an entire chapter of history was rewritten on paper, while the real stories of forced labor, exploitation, and complicity remained buried beneath layers of bureaucratic red tape. The secrecy held firm for decades. Only in the early 1970s did declassified documents begin to surface, revealing the extent of the whitewashing. Yet even then, many of the altered records persisted in official archives, a lingering testament to how far the government was willing to go to protect a strategic advantage. By late 1945, the first wave of German engineers arrived on American soil. Among them stood Werner von Braun, the charismatic architect of the V-2 program. The team was dispatched to White Sands, New Mexico, a barren expanse that would become a crucible for America's nascent missile effort. Here, under the watchful eyes of Army officials, they began testing modified V-2 rockets, now designated as the Redstone series. The work at White Sands was both continuation and transformation. The German engineers brought detailed schematics, production techniques, and an understanding of high-altitude propulsion that far outstripped any American counterpart. In return, they received state-of-the-art facilities, generous funding, and a promise of citizenship for themselves and their families. The Redstone missile soon proved its worth during the Korean War, providing a reliable platform for delivering conventional warheads. More importantly, it laid the technical foundation for the later development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. The desert tests demonstrated that with German expertise, the United States could not only catch up to, but potentially surpass Soviet capabilities in rocketry. Across the Atlantic, Soviet intelligence was engaged in its own frantic scramble. The NKVD dispatched agents into occupied Germany, seeking to capture the same pool of scientific talent. By early 1946, Moscow had secured a modest number of engineers, but they could not match the scale of the American operation. The disparity sharpened an emerging arms race that would dominate global politics for the next half-century. Aware that the Soviets were also hunting German expertise, US policymakers accelerated their missile programs. Funding for Project Vanguard and later the Army Ballistic Missile Agency surged. The presence of von Braun's team in America became a strategic asset, not merely a scientific boon, but a geopolitical lever. Each successful test launch sent a clear message. The United States possessed both the know-how and the will to develop weapons that could rival any Soviet counterpart. The rivalry intensified when the USSR launched Sputnik in 1957, shocking the American public and exposing gaps in US space capability. Yet even as the nation grappled with this setback, the German engineers, now fully integrated into American defense structures, were already drafting plans for more powerful rockets that could carry payloads beyond Earth's orbit. When NASA was created in 1958, it inherited a substantial portion of the paperclip workforce. The agency's early projects, such as Explorer and Mercury, were built upon technologies refined by von Braun and his colleagues. By the early 1960s, these engineers had risen to senior positions, directing the design of the Saturn V rocket, the colossal launch vehicle that would eventually carry astronauts to the moon. The transition from weapons development to space exploration was more than a change in purpose. It represented an ideological shift. The same thrust chambers once used to deliver warheads now propelled humanity toward a shared dream of lunar landing. Yet the underlying expertise remained rooted in the knowledge harvested from Nazi Germany, and the moral ambiguities persisted behind closed doors. When Apollo 11 touched down on July 20, 1969, the world celebrated a triumph of science and perseverance. Few remembered that the rocket's engines bore the fingerprints of men who had once built weapons for a regime responsible for unspeakable atrocities. The public narrative glorified the mission, while the shadows of its origins remained largely invisible. It was not until the 1970s, amid rising anti-war sentiment and investigative journalism, that the veil began to lift. Reporters uncovered documents linking von Braun and other senior NASA figures to the Nazi war machine. Activist groups demanded transparency, arguing that a nation built on democratic ideals could not ignore the past deeds of its scientific elite. Congress held hearings where former intelligence officers testified about Operation Paperclip's secrecy. Some defended the program as a necessary compromise in an existential struggle against Soviet expansion. Others expressed remorse for allowing individuals with tainted histories to shape national policy. The debates were fierce but often fell short of concrete accountability, as many of the scientists had already retired or received pardons. Nevertheless, the public discourse forced institutions to confront uncomfortable truths. Universities began scrutinizing past collaborations, and museums added context to exhibits on space exploration. The ethical conversation sparked by these revelations continues to echo in contemporary debates over scientific responsibility and governmental secrecy. In the 1990s, a series of congressional investigations revisited Operation Paperclip with fresh eyes. Testimony from surviving participants painted a picture of calculated pragmatism. "We saved the nation," one former OSS officer claimed, "by putting expertise above ideology." Yet the same testimonies also revealed internal dissent. Some officials had opposed granting blanket immunity, fearing long-term moral damage. Legislation was proposed to formally acknowledge the program's complexities, but most bills stalled amid partisan disagreements. Many of the original scientists had already been honored with medals and commendations for their contributions to national defense and space exploration. Their legacies, now intertwined with both scientific achievement and ethical controversy, remain a paradox that resists simple resolution. The legacy extends beyond individuals. The precedent set by Operation Paperclip, prioritizing strategic advantage over legal accountability, has informed subsequent U.S. policies regarding the recruitment of foreign expertise, whether in cyber warfare or biotechnology. It serves as a reminder that the choices made in moments of crisis can echo through generations. Today, scholars reassess the program not merely as a historical footnote, but as a lens through which to examine current policy dilemmas. The integration of former adversaries into critical sectors raises questions about vetting, transparency, and the balance between security and morality. Modern debates over granting asylum to scientists from hostile regimes echo the same tensions that defined Paperclip's inception. Moreover, public awareness of this hidden chapter influences how we view contemporary space initiatives. Private companies now dominate launch capabilities, yet they inherit technologies whose lineage traces back to those German engineers. The conversation about ethical responsibility in scientific advancement has broadened, encompassing climate change, artificial intelligence, and beyond areas where the temptation to sidestep moral scrutiny for rapid progress persists. In reflecting on Operation Paperclip, we confront a fundamental truth. The pursuit of knowledge does not occur in a vacuum. It is shaped by the values we choose to uphold or ignore. The rockets that carried us to the moon were built on foundations laid in secrecy. The missiles that deterred war were forged from compromised ethics. Recognizing this intertwined history invites us to demand greater accountability, ensuring that future breakthroughs are guided not only by ingenuity, but also by an unwavering commitment to justice.